Welcome to what I'm calling Beyond the Box, Powering Intrusion Investigations. So the genesis for this talk has been my experience as an incident responder, as an investigator, out in the corporate world working on investigations. And as part of my job in facilitating those investigations and performing analysis, we need a lot of data from our clients. And I find that a lot of organizations have implemented a lot of different tools. And so they've got the dashboards, and they've got pie charts, and they've got graphs of interesting things about the network. They may have a security event management system, but ultimately they haven't implemented the procedures and really tested use cases that enable them to derive useful information from those tools that they have in an investigative context. So on the agenda for today, I want to spend a few minutes at the beginning of this talking about what is an investigation, how do you get into an investigation, what are some of the key things, key goals of an investigation, and what types of data do you need, and then review 5 capabilities that I have found very important to providing data that is needed to do an investigation. I wanted to state up front that I'm not going to be talking about specific tools to answer these 5 capabilities. As appropriate as I'm going through, I'll mention where there are techniques that you can use and where there are open source or commercial tools. But ultimately, this is really not about the tools. This is about understanding the capabilities and then applying the multitude of tools that are out there, some of which your organizations may and probably already possess to get to the heart of that problem. So the 5 capabilities are, number 1, if you have an IP address, so an internal IP address and a timestamp, you need to have the capability to take that information and determine what host that corresponds to, so the computer system, the host name. If you have an account name that is of interest in your investigation, you need to be able to take that account name and for some period of time figure out where that account has been used to authenticate. You need to be able to have an internet IP address, so you think attacker command and control, and figure out what other systems in the environment besides the 1 or 2 that you may know about have communicated with that address. And I mean currently, and then also going back some time into the past. The same goes for domain name resolution attempts. So if you have a fully qualified domain name that's associated with an attacker tool, usually a backdoor, you need to be able to track what systems have resolved that domain name. Similar, but also different than looking at the network activity, and I'll explain why later. And then 5th, and this is very important, you need the capability to query your environment, searching for indicators of compromise. And this is really important to take the results of your investigation as it's progressing and convert that into useful information that's going to allow you to run your investigation across the entire enterprise. And in all but the very smallest organizations, this is a really critical component. So as we go through, I'd like you to put yourself in an investigator's shoes. So picture that as we go through these case studies, that you're the person that's responsible within your organization, or within one of your clients, if you're a consultant, for figuring out what's going on, what is this attacker doing in the environment, what data did they steal, how do we get them out of here? And consider, as we go through these, today, if this were to happen in your organization, so if somebody gave you the piece of information that I'm about to show you as a prompt for the use case, what would you be able to do with that information? Would you, if you would say immediately, yes, we definitely have this capability, we could get you that information, here's how we would do it, that's great. If the answer is that, this would be difficult, then I would suggest that it's something that you may want to think about doing to take that thought back and kind of integrate that into your ongoing security projects to try and get that data. The worst time to be first thinking about these issues is when you're in the middle of an investigation. Beginning of investigation. That's where I am all the time with my clients, where things have hit proverbial fans. You're working late nights, you're working 20 plus hours a day until you're exhausted and sleeping at the office, and executives are hammering your boss with questions and you're trying to get answers. That's not the time to be thinking about, do I have this capability? I would suggest building your own use cases. So take what I'm saying here, which is my experience. Take your own experience from the types of investigations that you've done, either at other jobs or at your current organization, and come up with a set of capabilities that you think are useful in the context of your organization. And it really is individualized. It depends on what service providers you may have that may provide capabilities that you don't need to duplicate, et cetera. But basically come up with these use cases and figure out what are we going to do from here? How can we build these capabilities? It's going to be hard work. I would be a billionaire and be retired if I'd come up with a way to solve this problem in an easy way. But there really is no shortcut. This is definitely going to be a lot of hard work, but it will pay off on the unfortunate day when you are in an incident. So to give you a little bit of context of who I am and what I do, I'm a senior manager with a company called Mandiant, which is a subsidiary of FireEye. And my world is primarily running incident investigations, mostly for Fortune 500 type companies. Last year I did 10 investigations personally. In our organization, we had somewhere around 200. So we do this a lot. This is what I do every day. And a lot of what I do during a response is, so I'm a team lead. I'm interfacing with different specialists on my team, making sure they're looking at the right things, making sure that their work's accurate, et cetera. And then also interfacing with the client. So I'm kind of the person who has to have these same discussions and the things I'm going to relate to you today with the client and explain, look, we really need you to tell us what this host name is, because if you can't tell us what that host name is, or if you're going to give me a list of 10 systems that may have had this IP address, maybe, then we're going to have to spend this level of effort to look at those 10 systems, et cetera. So working with clients to get answers to a lot of these questions. So to give you a little context on investigations, and it's been my experience, and this really depends on the type of work you do as an investigator, but the majority of the incidents that I've been involved in started with a notification from a law enforcement agency. And I'll caveat this with my experience is mostly United States or European-based companies. I really have not done that much work in Asia, but I would expect it's probably similar. So what happens in these situations is the government knocks on your door. In the US, it's often the Federal Bureau of Investigation or maybe other agencies depending on what type of attacker is involved. And they say, you guys have a problem. Let me give you a list of IP addresses. Here's 3 accounts that are compromised. Thank you, have a good day. And it's not that they're being mean on purpose. They have other objectives in the investigative work that they do. They're providing you some information as a courtesy, and it's very limited. Keep in mind, if you're on the receiving end of a notification from an external party, whether it's law enforcement or another peer organization or someone else, that the information that they provide you is probably not complete. So it's really important to take this as, this is interesting. This is the tip of a potential iceberg. Let me make sure that I got this, that this is all the systems. Because in my experience, say they tell you that you have 3 systems that are infected, very often that the number is actually much higher than that. And if all you do is remove those 3, that's a problem. The other way that my clients identify these is they'll self-identify it, which in the cases I did last calendar year, there was 3 out of 10 that actually found it themselves without having to get notified by law enforcement. So usually how they identify it is a sysadmin or a security person identifies something unusual that usually antivirus catches. So in this case, I've got a couple of sanitized screenshots from reports. Basically, this was a password hash dumper that was running on a workstation. In one case I had last year, they actually caught hash dumper running on the domain controller, which what was helpful about it is rather than look at it and say, great win for antivirus, let's move on with the day, they asked the golden question, which is, how did this password hash dumper get on my domain controller? And then that turned in, the attacker had been in their environment for a bit over 2 years. So these are the questions. And by the way, if you have the Black Hat CD, the conference CD, most of the slides, so the slides that have bullet points and more words, those are on the CD. The ones with the screenshots are sanitized reports and things are not. And also the white paper, that's also on the CD, has a lot of this information in even more depth and also has references and other suggested reading. So these are some questions that the executives in the company and your boss is going to ask if you picture you're the investigative lead. So what is exposed? Did we lose the secret formula? And then the next question that brings to mind is, well, what am I going to have to do about this? Because their world is, all right, great. Am I going to be on the news? Do I have to notify regulators? Do I have to notify my customers? How bad is this? Is this one system? Can I go to bed at night or in sleep, or is this 1,000 systems? How much money did we lose? Which is also, of course, very important. How did the attacker get in so we can close those doors? And then the bottom line is, how do we effectively stop this attack and recover from it, move on, close the doors? So I want to illustrate one of the reasons that it's very important to do the investigation correctly. And this is because this is how if you do the better investigation you perform, the more thorough, the better your remediation effort is going to be. So in this example, and this is from a presentation I did at Black Hat 2 years ago on targeted threat remediation, and I have the reference to that white paper if you're interested in the topic. But basically, picture this: somebody came to you and said you're infected. You have an attack on your network. There's 3 systems that are infected, or sorry, 1 system that's infected. They'll tell you about this PC1, PC2, and web servers also infected. You clean PC1, you thank them, and you clean it. But if you don't do any investigation, you don't realize that you have no way to tell that PC2 is still infected, still under the attacker's control. The web shell that's on the web server is still infected and still under the attacker's control. So you really haven't done anything except for, maybe if the attacker cares to notice, you've told him that you know about whatever he did to that PC1 and about this command and control. So the better you can answer these questions that were posed, the better you can remediate. Another example, and I wanted to point this out, this will be a theme a bit later, is some of these questions that we asked, that I'm going to ask, relate to, you want to understand the totality of what the attacker did. So you don't want to just chase malware, which is what I see a lot of less experienced investigators doing. So in this situation, you've got 2 laptops that have been phished, and they're communicating with some command and control. And by the way, all the IP addresses and domain names and everything you see in here are totally chosen at random. So if this is anybody's company, I apologize. You're not actually owned. So these 2 pieces of systems are compromised. But if all you do is find the malware, you're only going to find these 2 systems. You're going to miss the fact that there was some interesting activity on this application server. There's net use, and wonder what the attacker was doing on those file servers. Maybe he was grabbing files, or he also FTP'd out. What was he doing on this database server? You're going to miss all those contextual details, which could be very important to understanding what really happened. So it's important to investigate the intrusion and the activities that usually are being performed by, in the case of any targeted threat, by a human being. It's not just a piece of malware. So those high-level questions that I laid out earlier, that's what the executives are going to be asking. That's what your boss is going to be getting hammered with multiple times a day in meetings all day. So I want to go over, so what are the questions you need to answer now as an investigation lead, as a technical person? So how far back does this go? When is the earliest evidence of compromise? In certain types of investigations, this is really important and has a bottom line impact. Like, for example, if you process payment data, or if you've lost credit card information, especially credit card information, but also other types of regulated personal information, you live and die by this, because if say your systems were only compromised last week, well, if you can shut it down tonight, then your window of compromise that the credit card brands are going to hold you, accountable for is pretty limited. If you can say, yep, the attacker definitely showed up on this day. If you can't determine that, or if it turns out the attacker's been in the environment for a year, then your exposure just went up greatly from a legal perspective. How did the attacker get in? You want to know this, obviously, so that you can perform the right remediation tasks and make it so that it's harder, hopefully, for the attacker to get in next time. What's the latest evidence of activity? So we want to know when the attacker got in, but we also want to know, is the attacker currently in the environment right now? And if so, what is he doing? Sometimes the attacker will be actively coming back daily, stealing information, or doing whatever they've come to do. In some cases, the attacker will have systems compromised and infected in the environment so that he can come back when he wants, but he's not actually doing anything. So you want to know that too. What's the attacker doing? What systems are under the attacker's control? So you want to know what the attacker touched, which is what I would call compromised. And you also want to know if a system's infected with malware, because that's something that if the attacker has a backdoor on a system, or has configured some sort of condition that is a backdoor, like the sticky keys backdoor configuration, you want to know that so that you can clean all that up and make sure that the attacker cannot get back into your environment. That's containment. You want to know what systems the attacker accessed? It might not be as exciting if you really love malware and finding malware, but if you want to find data theft and you want to know what the attacker stole, you need to look for what systems did the attacker access. And what did he do? So what did the attacker do on these systems that he targeted? So did the attacker simply connect to a system and do a directory listing? Did the attacker browse through certain directories? If so, which ones? Maybe you can tell what type of data they were after. How does the attacker maintain access to the environment? So persistence. Do they have backdoors that are running? Do they have access to your VPN? By the way, if you don't have two-factor authentication for your VPN, you should write that down as a note and go do that like this week, because that's a way that attackers will also maintain access. How's the attacker operating inside the environment? So lateral movement. This is really this is going to help you investigate and determine systems that he's accessed that might not be obvious because they might not contain malware. What tools is the attacker deployed? You want to be able to identify those tools and what they do. And then also, what accounts did the attacker compromise? Because the attacker is going to be generally anybody but the least sophisticated targeted attacker is going to grab some accounts and then use those inside your network, and it's going to look normal. So this is not magic. In order to answer all of these questions that I've outlined, you need data points. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to go through some specific examples of the types of data points you need and why you need them. So mapping an IP address to a host name. This is an excerpt that's been sanitized from a report from a third party to one of my clients in the beginning of an investigation. And so they said that on this particular date, the attacker command and control right here was used to control this system here, which is in your network, 172.19.243.23. And they said that, okay, he accessed a backdoor. So there was a backdoor on this system. And there's a list of data. Here's what he did. And by the way, on this day, he accessed these three other systems from this pivot point. So system 1, IP address, system 2, IP address, and then unknown. You don't know what the system name is. So you definitely want to take a look at what he may have done on these systems, because he could have stolen data. He could have maybe stolen credentials to come back later. He might have stolen a certificate. He might have actually put another backdoor on a system that you might not know about. So essentially, this is what you're really worried about here. So this random, so the host name that you know about, this is the one that was listed in the report. This guy over here, who you don't know yet because you haven't been able to find that host name, is a backdoor, is it data theft? What did he do? So DHCP logs. In the majority of environments, vast majority, DHCP services are provided by domain controllers that are local in the environment where your endpoints are in data centers. Mainly, we're talking about workstations and laptops here, because servers generally have IPs that don't change too much. Although you still want the DHCP logs for anywhere that's releasing DHCP. This is showing in the control panels in the DHCP control panel where you can enable logging. So it really is literally here something where you can just check the box. Windows will start recording the log and storing it locally, and this is basically what you get. So what you can get here is that on 221.14, this IP address 78.20 was assigned to the system with hostname win2k8 member 1, and then it's got the MAC address, which can sometimes be useful. So this is the type of information that you're going to get. It is a challenge in order to do something with it. You want to make sure that even if you don't have a SIM, so ideally you would have SIM collectors everywhere you have DHCP, a security and event management tool, and you would be pulling those logs somewhere where you can execute a quick query and just type in the IP address, filter by the date, and it'll just show you those events. But you want to make sure that you're logging it, even if you don't have a SIM, because even if you don't have a SIM, you can still go to that DHCP server when you're doing an investigation and query those logs, but only if you've been generating them. So it's really important to start generating those and capturing them. Another way that you can do this, so say you don't have a SIM, you could even create something simple like a scheduled task to push the log files to a central repository. So it's not very pretty to do this, especially in a big organization, but I have seen it done. An investigation that I did last year. They didn't have this capability. We tried to put it in place, and the best they could do is to basically ship these logs to a file share. And so I got a workstation on their network that I had access to, and then I ran power grep against those logs whenever I needed to look up something with DHCP. Another large global organization I worked with a couple of years ago, actually, they had one of the contractors that worked for their security team come in and basically built something based on Nmap that would scan the network with Nmap, looking for retrieving the binding between the host names and IPs and pushing it into a MySQL database. He whipped this up in less than a day. It was crude, but it did get the job done. Another thing that a lot of organizations rely on here is control panels for things like your antivirus or your system management agents. Those will typically provide you some kind of mapping historically of which system checked in at a given time, and through that you can determine what host name had which IP. That's not as good as having the DHCP logs, because that's only going to cover systems that are that have those agents on them. So if there was a system, basically a non-Windows or non-domain member system, or a contractor laptop or something that didn't have your agent, then you won't be able to query it in there. So very important. I put this as number one, and these aren't generally in order, but I find that if you're not able to map a system name to an IP address, a lot of the other things I'm going to talk about you can end up with dead ends, where say you're logging packets, destinations, and a firewall at the firewall. So you're logging connections to C2, and you get a hit, and you got an IP address from, say, 3 months ago. But if you don't know what host name it is, then that information is not really that useful. So this is foundational. Okay. So moving on, the second capability that I wanted to highlight is systems. You want to find out which systems a particular account authenticated to. So this is an excerpt that I sanitized from the top of a triage report. So call this hostname pivot system. And the part I wanted to highlight is, first thing that happened was, so this domain/service account logged on from system A, and then logged in to other systems. So the bottom line is, that the attacker's demonstrated that he's been using this account in this time period. So from the pivot system, that the attacker's logged into some other systems through the system analysis that you've done. And the reason this is important is, so I said earlier, all but the most simplistic targeted attackers are going to use legitimate credentials as part of an intrusion. So this on the screen here is a model that I use to explain the life cycle of a targeted intrusion. And the idea is that not every intrusion is going to have all these phases, but essentially there's an initial compromise that's preceded by some reconnaissance. The attacker gains a foothold, so that's the first system. If you picture a phishing attack that starts with phishing, that's that very first system that he manages to compromise. From there, the attacker will escalate their privileges, obtain credentials for that first system that they popped, and then use those to perform reconnaissance and move around the network, ultimately looking for usually some sort of data that they're looking to steal. So this is important to know. The reason I put this in here is that because attackers are moving around with legitimate credentials, having the capability to query your event logs are very important to be able to track this kind of activity. This is an area where I see a lot of weakness out there. Even companies that have security and event management tools, most of them don't really have them what I would call fully deployed, even in the server population. So they may have domain controller logs, but they don't have a lot of other logs to, especially from servers that can help this. So given this information, so there's some pivot system, and you know that the attacker's been using the service account. So that's the key piece of information. Here's what could be happening. Here's one possible explanation, and you need these logs in order to kind of ferret out what's going on. So it could be that there's a laptop that's been compromised, so this user got phished with whatever the latest, maybe this latest Word doc vulnerability, and his system's communicating with this particular C2 server. And I'm going to make a leap here and say, so this is something that we see sometimes in various investigations that we do. So the attacker is operating through this system. So if you can picture, the back door on the system has proxy functionality that's like a SOX proxy. So rather than doing a lot of dirty work on this laptop, because this is the one that's infected, so you're kind of like, you may find that one, or somebody may find it and tell you about it. The attacker is going to be sneaky and not use that. So he's going to just proxy through, and he's going to RDP to some other random system. So call it a pivot system. Some of the things that the attacker may be doing with that account, that domain service account, is maybe he's connected to an application server and installed some kind of unknown backdoor. So net use, copy some files up, schedule a task with the @ command, because he's got credentials. Maybe they're not even a domain admin. Maybe he just has some server admin credentials, or maybe he compromised somebody in IT and has some kind of low-level admin, but he's able to access his server. So maybe he's going to put a backdoor on there, and maybe it's a backdoor that you don't currently know about. But if you follow the trail, you know that the attacker is using this account, the service account, and so what you should do is look for all of the places within that time window. So you know the attacker was active on those dates that I mentioned. You would want to start looking at the logs to try and find out what else was that account used for. So some of those things are probably going to be legitimate, and it's going to take some work working with whoever uses that account to try and figure out what's legitimate and what's not. But some of it's going to set off alarms, and you probably won't know this as the investigator because it's not what you do. But when you sit down with the application admin and show them the list of accounts and say, or the list of systems that authenticated to, they're going to say, wait a minute. This system's in the other division. There's no reason that this account would ever authenticate there. That's a red flag. Then you want to go look at that system. The other thing that you're looking for is maybe the attacker logged into this file server from the pivot system, and maybe he copied some files, and maybe that was actually what he FTP'd out of the environment. So maybe he stole data, and if you don't do this exercise, then you'll miss that. The other thing, maybe he RDP'd into this database and then dumped some data out of database tables and then shipped that off. So you know about this stuff down here that's in the lower right corner. So you know that he was PS execing to system A, system B, and system C. But all this up here, you don't know about. So you want to be able to search for a couple of different things. So you want to be able to take the domain/service account, and you want to be able to look for where did that account log in from the source of this pivot system. The other thing that would be useful is if you could look for, all right, you know that the attacker was on the pivot system. So you know he was on the pivot system on a particular day because you've got these artifacts that show you he was active on the system. Say he was active on the system on Sunday. So you want to look for on Sunday, around the time the attacker was on the system, say he was on the system from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. You want to look and see what network connections originated from that system at all within the account, because there may be another account is using. So one of the ways that you can do this is to look for logs on the domain controllers for Kerberos service tickets. I don't have time to go into all the specifics of Kerberos, which is one of the underpinnings of Active Directory authentication. If you don't, so ideally you would have logs fed into a SIM from all these servers. So you would be able to just run the query and it would run all the data. But in most environments where I investigate, they usually have some logs from domain controllers, but they don't have all the servers logged yet. It's always on their plan. They're going to do it sometime and they just don't have it done yet. But with these Kerberos service tickets, when a user, or really an account, requests access to a resource, there's this exchange with the domain controller where they're issued a service ticket that says, okay, yes, you're allowed to access this resource. So here's what you can do with it. So this is from my test environment. So I have this scenario down here, which is I have Win2K3 member 1, which is .20, and I have Win2K3 member 2, which is .21. So I did a net use command and just mapped a file share from one to the other. This is what you get, and this is Windows 2003. So what you get is you get three important pieces. Username, user001. You get service name, which is basically where they logged into, so that the target of that authentication, Win2K3 member 2. And then you get the client address, which is where they were. So where was the user when they authenticated, when this ticket was issued, and the user was sitting right here. So I've used this on investigations before to identify additional systems we should look at. So what would happen if you're back on this diagram is you'd probably maybe you get 20 or 30 systems where this account was used. And you're going to have to just talk to somebody and figure out, okay, these are the 5 systems that it always logs into, and it logs in every 5 minutes automatically. So those ones are okay. But then the other ones, you may need to do some manual triage and look, and from a timeline perspective say, okay, I know that this account logged in at this time. Did anything else weird happen? Oh, yes, there was a scheduled task that was created right 5 seconds after that. That's weird. And so you want to go through that process to identify these things. This is an example from a commercial SIM product that I did recently, where I'm sorry I had to redact so much here, but Basically, I did a payload contains hostname, so I had a pivot system that I was looking for. Event ID 673, which is Kerberos service ticket issued, and then a date range, and then payload contains account name. So I was looking for events in a certain time and a certain range, a time frame, from a certain system using a certain account. I do need to point out that in Windows 2003, RDP authentications work a bit differently. In 2008, you'll get the correct source address. In Windows 2003, you'll not, because the service ticket's actually issued with .21 as the client, which is I'm RDPing from member 1 to member 2. And then the event that's recorded is basically showing that the IP address source was member 2, which is not really that helpful. So to keep that in mind if you're looking at the Kerberos service tickets. With Windows 2008 with NLA enabled, I've got a link that talks about what that is. It's correct because the authentication mechanism is a bit different in that version. So key things, you want to make sure you're logging all authentication events, and you want to log successful ones. I talked to an organization a couple weeks ago that they had a lot of different logging that they were doing, but they're only logging failed authentication events, which really are the less interesting ones in my view for most of my purposes. You want to make sure that even if you don't have a SIM, that you're still logging them and you still have a sufficient amount of events on the system. The reason is, even if you don't have a SIM, you can take other measures at the time that you need that info to go out and grab it. And I'll talk about some of those later. So ideally, push these into a SIM. Or if you don't have that capability, you can push these logs to a central location for searching. That gets that doesn't scale very well. You can do it in an emergency, and I've done it before with what I would say smaller environments, like maybe under 5,000 systems. Otherwise, the amount of data just gets too big, and that's when you should just buy a SIM. This is a diagram from a status updates that I do as part of my weekly updates to my clients. And what I wanted to do is illustrate. So there's a couple of lines here. The two that I wanted to highlight are, so this compromised system line, which is this purple, it's going up slowly. So this blue line that goes up and then down is basically the to be determined systems, which are the ones that are on our queue to look at. So as the investigation starts up, we're finding more and more things, more and more potentially compromised systems, et cetera, and doing more review. So that peaks, putting a lot of things on the queue, doing it, we're getting it down. But then right here, where this compromised systems peaks, I basically was that query. There was a pivot system. We knew the attacker was active, and I used Kerberos service tickets to identify, a couple hundred systems that the attacker accessed. And basically, we determined they were dumping hashes from those systems. But it was good to know, although ultimately it was helpful information, but not critical. But we could have also identified a backdoor that we didn't know about previously. I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is in the slides on the CD as well as in the white paper. Some suggestions of things that you might want to log. If you compare this to some of the other guidelines that are out there, you'll notice that there's some differences of some of the events that are commonly recommended. I don't find much use of investigatively, and they tend to occur really frequently. So I don't recommend those. But these ones are important. So anything related to account logons or logons, you want to capture that success and failed. And then there's some additional events that relate to like reconnections to RDP sessions that are interesting, as well as logons and logoffs. Oh, and explicit credentials can be really interesting as well. So next, determining the systems that communicated to a specific IP address. Whoops. So 3 pieces of information on here that are important are attacker C2 node was 1234567.8. And then blah, blah, blah. On this day, the attacker reconfigured this other backdoor. So this backdoor was originally communicating with this address, and then he configured it to communicate with this new address. So 3 pieces of information. So with this information, what you want to do is, so you have one system it's infected. You already know it's infected because you knew that already. But there's another one that is also connecting to that same command and control that you didn't know about. So this is helpful. If you can query NetFlow, if you can query, if you can log firewall logs, packet accepts going out, if if you have basically anything that'll let you query who's gone to this IP address, web proxies as well. But this will also help you find another system. So this system is known to be infected. This is that system that had the backdoor changed to another IP. So it's going to C2 number 2, which you know about. But what if I told you next that that information was 2 months old? So the attacker 2 months ago, this backdoor was pointing to this C2 here, number 3. But so 2 months ago it was configured here. Today it's pointing to a different one. But maybe there's an additional system here that you don't know about that was is currently communicating with this command and control, and you just got that IP from historical information. So my point is you want to be able to also leverage information back in time to look for systems that you may have otherwise missed. So for this, so I mentioned NetFloat. Most organizations that I work with at least have logging for firewall. The border firewall is logging successful packets going out of the network. That's very helpful. I would keep as much of that as you can. If you get to where traffic is storage becomes an issue, you can start applying some filters. Like you don't necessarily need to know every time somebody goes to your corporate website or one of your top business partners' websites or Yahoo or Google or whatever. So you can filter some of that out. If you do that, I would don't filter out ranges that are associated with hosting services. Like you wouldn't want to filter out all of Amazon space because there's any of those hosting providers where you can easily set up shop and an attacker may use for C2. Make sure that you test that you can actually use this data before you have to communicate, before you get in a situation where you have to use it. And then also further ensure that you have DHCP so that you have DHCP logs so that if you get a hit, say from 2 months ago, you go back in time and you say, wow, I didn't know this was a command and control address, but I'm querying my logs and I noticed that 2 months ago, I had a system that was going to that address, but it stopped. You still need to look at that system because it may have been infected and maybe now the attacker uninstalled the backdoor, but you may still need to rebuild that system because the backdoor may be on there. And finally, you can use this to implement an alerting capability. So if you have an attacker that's active in the environment, even if you don't have a lot of other sophisticated tools, one of the things that one of my clients did recently was they implemented an alerting capability where the attacker was not active. They knew what the C2 IP addresses were, and they knew that the data size was always between 80 and 105 bytes without fail. So they basically implemented an alert that said, anytime this packet size is above 105, send me a text message. And it worked. There was a time where there was some activity where the attacker came back. And by came back, I basically mean use the command and control infrastructure to actually take control of that system that the backdoor was on. And it was an effective capability. Next, tracking domain name resolution attempts. So this is an excerpt screenshot that I sanitized out of one of the tools that we use internally in investigations in our managed service clients to track network traffic. So it's basically showing a successful DNS resolution response. So we actually don't track the queries. We track when the response comes back. We're looking for that response. And so bottom line is a particular system. So this requesting DNS server 87654321 requested and successfully resolved reallybadnet.com. And this was the authoritative DNS server. That's not really that important. So here's one case. If this is the way your DNS works in your organization, then you're lucky because this is the simple case. So infected system queried their DNS server, which relayed the query out to the internet, went through its recursion if necessary, and then came back. So what you have when you get that alert, or you get an alert from maybe the government in the case of a notification, they tell you, hey, this is reallybad.com is bad. You need to look for all systems going to that. And so I'll continue, hopefully, while we fix that. I don't know what's going on. Excuse me. Could I get some help here? The screen seems to have gone off. The screen's, yeah. I'll just keep talking. So basically, the system's infected. It's going out through one DNS server. So you want to have logs on that one DNS server in order to low tech problem. Oops, my bad. Touched it. All right, I'm backing away. So basically, you want to have logs on this system because if you want to be logging DNS because you need to know who queried that. So my network monitor that I pointed out was sitting right here. So we know that someone in the organization resolved this bad domain name, but we don't know who. In order to figure out who, you need to have a log that associates a client that made the query. It more commonly looks like this, which means that in a big global company, you're probably pointing to your local domain controller for DNS, which makes sense. And they're probably pointed to some regional, which is pointed to something, which is sometime you get to the edge. What you want to make sure is that on the systems where your endpoints are resolving DNS, those are where you want your logs to be and pull those into a SIM. Because if somebody's querying a domain name and you may be looking for that as your perimeter, you want to be able to follow up quickly and determine who, because that system is, if it's something like this where it's a domain name that's definitively associated with malware, that it's not a common domain, it's probably bad, the system's probably infected. I'm running out of time, I need to skip that. So you can log this at a web proxy. That can be helpful as well. It's a bit easier to do than to do DNS logging on your DNS servers. Microsoft really makes it a pain because of the way you basically have to generate this flat file and then pick it up into the SIM. That's really the only way that I know to do it if you're doing DNS resolution on your domain controllers. If you have a purpose-built appliance, and there's some companies I've worked with that have these purpose-built DNS and DHCP appliances, those make it a lot more streamlined in order to implement the logging. If the volume of data becomes prohibitive, and when you start talking in big global companies about logging this, the network guys usually laugh at you and or throw stuff at you because we have 400 DNS servers and each of them generates, a gigabyte of information, a gigabyte of queries every 15 seconds, and it's just not going to work. What you can do is filter out events that are associated with your internal lookups, and then any common ones like, your Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, your business partners. You don't need to know who's resolving those. In my experience, that if you filter out the internal name lookups, that'll get rid of about 50%. And you should be able to filter this with the collector before it even goes into the SIM, so you don't even have the network load. Right. I want to make sure I had a little bit of time to spend on this. So the fifth capability is identifying indicators of compromise across the environment. And so this is really a game changer when you have this capability, because without this capability, you even really smart investigators that I've worked with that don't have a capability to extend their reach across their company are very limited in what they can do. So as you're investigating, you're finding indicators of compromise, which I'll explain in a minute. You want to be able to query your entire environment for that data. And this is not something that's easy to do. There are some tools out there that are purpose-built that have been designed for this purpose that you can use. You can also repurpose a lot of other tools that you may already have to do a lot of this. And then there's also options that include scripting, PowerShell WMI being some examples, vulnerability scanners. But the idea is you want to be able to query the environment and say, I have this thing that indicates that a system is compromised. It's a registry key or a memory artifact or file. I want to find out where is that anywhere? Because if you have this registry key, I want to look at your system because you may be compromised. So there's a couple of different ways you can think about an indicator. So an indicator could be something that's very specific to a tool, to a particular intrusion, or it may be something that's general. So it may be general badness, like if you've ever messed around with the auto runs tool from sysinternals, all of those the run keys and the other places where in the registry where programs can auto start. That's one example of a generic indicator would be, let me look through those for things that look anomalous. Like, do I have a very basic one that will catch some low-hanging commodity malwares? Do I have anything running or anything that's persistent in those keys that references a temp directory? That's weird. Do I have any processes running that the path is internet, temporary files? That's weird. It's probably bad. So you can look for specific malware. One of the things that we also do as we're doing an investigation is we usually create we call it the known bad indicator set. So it's basically, as we're learning more about what's going on in the environment, we're adding to that, and then we can look across the environment and continuously be checking for, are we missing anything? So if we know that there's these 20 things that are related to this particular intrusion, if we keep looking, what we want to see is we know everything. So every time we look, we want to say, okay, yep, 10 systems have that artifact. We know about all 10. Okay, everything's good. We know about those 10. We're going to fix them. Not we're running it and then we identify 5 things, 5 new ones. That may mean the attacker's still active, or it means that we're missing something. So this is the example that I want to use to kind of explain this, this process. So if you picture a server is infected. So it's got backdoor _ A. And it's communicating with baddomain.com, which currently resolves to 233456778. This particular backdoor is running as a malicious DLL that's associated with a legitimate Windows service. So very commonly, there will be a list of services that a particular piece of malware may hijack. This one happens to be using this remote routing remote access service. And you also know through your investigation that the attacker used this service account to communicate to a file server. So what you want to get out of this are, you want to look for host-based indicators, what can we look for, and network-based indicators. So what you want to think about is, what out of here can help me identify other systems that have been compromised? So some of the things that can indicate that from a network perspective. So if you see any successful packets destined for this IP address, that's something you want to look into, because that system's probably compromised. It may not be, though. It may be a false positive. It may be a hosting environment, and the attacker just happens to be renting space on a server that's got a lot of other legitimate sites. Any DNS queries or anything that you see in your web proxy for that bad domain, that's probably something you should look into. The other thing that you could look into is, if you understand how this backdoor A communicates over the network, you can look for patterns specific to that protocol. So that requires some more advanced capabilities in terms of being able to understand how the malware is actually working. But that's something that can be really powerful as well, because that way, if he comes out with backdoor _B that looks different, enough different on the disk that you're not finding it, and enough different that you're not finding it based on other host artifacts, you may see that protocol pop up. Like I did an investigation last year where there was an attacker we've seen year after year, and we detected, so he was using all new tools, but one of the tools he was using happened to be basically written the same network protocol. I probably just get copied and pasted that module. So even though it was brand new, we were able to immediately pick up that this system was infected, and it was this particular actor. Okay, host-based indicators. So some of these are very temporal. So these I wouldn't hang my hat on, but I'm starting with kind of the easy ones. So if the system has an established TCP connection, it's kind of the host-based side of that network indicator of talking to C2. Or if the DNS cache contains this bad domain, you could query that, from with a script. You could probably do it using WMI. Host-based indicators continued. So other things you want to look for, other things we talked about, if the security event log contains a successful authentication from this privileged account, or if it contains a logon from server A. So this is where having the SIM, being able to do the log queries, is going to really help you identify other systems. Another thing is that from your analysis of this server A that this particular, it's a service persistence mechanism, and so there's a registry key that references this, there's a particular DLL name. It's not the name, if the name's different, you might not find it, but you can look for this sneaky.dll and may find that same malware. Some other things that you can look for, and some of these are a bit more advanced, and this is really one of the ways that the more customized you're able to do this, and the more you're able to extend your reach through different tools, this will make your investigation even more complete, because you'll be able to get a better grasp on what's going on. So some other things you can look for: file has MD5 hash, matches the exact DLL. Well, so antivirus can do this. There's other ways you can do it, but if most companies have antivirus mostly across their Windows environment, so you can look for that. But the problem, of course, is that if there's anything different about it, you're not going to find that DLL. Another thing that you can think about is, okay, this particular file has a compiled timestamp that's this, and has this size. So there may be variants of this DLL that are different. And so the MD5 is not going to match, but they're pretty much the same thing functionally. Wow, that's loud. So that may catch variance. Another thing that you could do, and this is getting more, you're going to have some capabilities to really understand the malware. There may be a unique combination of function imports that you can use to say that it's likely you're going to have some false positives, and this may require some more advanced tools or scripting to do. But basically looking for the fingerprint that, for example, you know that a password hash dumper is going to have to import these 10 Windows functions to do its work. You could combine that with some other information to try and catch other tools that are probably doing the same thing. Granted, you're going to get more false positives, but it can work. The other thing you could do is looking for, okay, you know that when the malware is running, that it has a certain mutex that it uses to make sure that it doesn't start up a bunch of times. If the attacker likes to reuse code, just cut and paste from another library, then you may find that this is helpful. So to really do this, you first identify indicators through forensic analysis and network analysis, and then you need to have this capability to go out across the environment. So I mentioned antivirus. Antivirus is definitely one way that you can look for MD5 hashes. Sometimes you can look for other attributes, like from a network perspective, you may be able to do something with host-based firewalls. It depends on what modules you have implemented. System and configuration management software. So if you have third-party tools, well, third-party, I mean like non-Microsoft, because I'll mention SCCM. Software inventory is one way. If you're looking for a specific registry key, you can use modules that were designed for licensing and compliance to basically go out and tell you where's that key. If you do that, keep in mind that the data that you're querying might not be current. It might represent the state, a week ago when the data was collected. You can also use, if you have third-party tools that you use to manage software, you can go out and oftentimes define a query that you can look for a file or a registry key or something like that. Network intrusion detection systems, very helpful. If you have IP addresses that you're looking for, domain names, if you can write custom signatures for any protocols, and granted, it's going to take some more advanced capabilities to do that. Those can be very helpful. The SIM we've talked about. Some vulnerability scanners have modules that you can repurpose to look for some of these artifacts. So I've seen one that it's a module where you can look for for software licensing. Tell me if XYZ is installed and the module works by checking for a registry key. You can use that to look for malware. Some of them also have the ability to look for a specific process or look for a specific file on disk. So if you have it, think outside the box about the tools that you already have, and that'll be helpful before you run out and go buy something else. PowerShell WMI is going to require a lot of legwork. There are some publicly available scripts. I have some links in the endnotes in the white paper that's on the CD that I found in my research for this that can be helpful. Of course, you have to have PowerShell installed on systems if you're going to do that. And then, of course, there's purpose-built tools. So to wrap up, and I want to make sure I have a couple minutes for questions, because I know I'm standing in the way of everyone and the drinks. Develop some use cases. Don't let the tool dictate your process. You need to make sure that the processes and your needs as investigators dictate the tools. So determine what capabilities you need for your environment, and then define the use cases, figure out what you can do with your existing tools, and then figure out if there's anything else that you need to add, rather than doing it the other way around. And there's no one tool is going to solve your problem. This is not a tools problem. It's you need processes, and you need an understanding of what's going on and what you're looking for. It's not a single tool. Also, and just kind of as a final thought that I had as I was writing the white paper, in the really big picture of this, I would make sure that from an IR perspective that you're monitoring and capturing metrics that are useful and that useful to measure how your program's improving, as well as help you get support for getting some of these additional capabilities. Like if you're measuring how long does it take us from the time that we detect something is fishy to when it is actually contained on the network, that's helpful, and you can use that type of metric to show how you're improving, or also show the benefit of, if we had XYZ capability, we could have maybe done this faster, then the attacker would have only compromised 5 systems instead of 10, and maybe wouldn't have stolen this data. And then also mean time to detect. So how long was the attacker in your environment? Every organization is vulnerable to getting compromised. If the attacker is determined enough, I don't believe that it's something that on an enterprise scale that you can prevent the initial compromise. So what you want to think about is how fast can you stop it? So even the companies that are very mature capabilities, there's going to be some 0-day or something they haven't patched. They're going to get the initial compromise will happen. But from that point, if they're able to detect that in a matter of hours, it's usually not as bad than if, it's in the case of some organizations where they're compromised for years and they don't know it until someone knocks on the door. So with that, I'll open it up to questions, and thank you very much for your attention. All right, well, if there's no questions, thanks again. I'll be around during the next hour and a half if anybody wants to talk. Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Just one question. Here in Singapore, there is a requirement to have antivirus on each workstation, especially servers, Windows servers. Have you seen any cases when the antivirus will do more harm than good? Meaning antivirus is one step behind, and my thought, the antivirus might clean up system, basically, removing all the traces, so it's going to be difficult for investigation.
Yeah, so I've seen that be an issue. Generally, I wouldn't find it to be a problem to have antivirus installed everywhere. My caveat would be if I would make sure that whatever files it quarantines, it quarantines them rather than just deleting them, because I have run into that problem where it deletes the evidence. But a lot of times I find that antivirus doesn't detect a lot of this. Actually, reviewing your antivirus logs for anomalies can be one way to really proactively, well, it's not really proactive, but really effectively detect the middle of some of these compromises, where antivirus is pretty good at detecting some types of mass market credential dumpers. So if they use a generic PW dump or FG dump or something, you can detect it. So I would recommend, kind of on the antivirus note, make sure that your triage process has something in it, a note where the analyst should consider whether this may be part of something bigger, rather than just saying, okay, yep, it got caught, let's rebuild it, because that's the default answer in most big companies. It's got malware, rebuild it. Whereas you may be missing the fact that that was the sign that the guy is in your environment, that the attacker's in your environment. So. Any other questions?
So all this kind of analysis is based on you knew that there is a control server connected to your inside, right? How do you determine this is a control server or not?
That's a much bigger topic, but it's definitely a good topic. What I would say is that it's really hard. Let me actually go back and let me use this as a way. So if you look at the attack lifecycle of the way, and this is targeted attacks. The initial compromise, you're probably not going to be able to detect that. I mean, if somebody had some tool that you could reliably detect that, then none of this other stuff would happen. There's always going to be something that gets exploited, some patch that's not applied. This is going to be difficult to detect. Establishing foothold from this is something where, and it's not easy, but if you look for common ways that malware persists on systems, that's one good way that you can detect these footholds. So a backdoor that's installed, by looking for anomalies, an anomalous running service, a process that has anomalous connections based on intelligence that you have, which again, it's difficult to know. So in your industry, there may be particular bulletins that come out. Like I know in the United States, in certain industries, they have working groups where they share information on attacks, and you can look for something you're seeing the same thing that they're seeing at another company. Escalating Escalating privileges also difficult to detect, except for if your antivirus happens to catch a credential dumper. I think a lot of it can be caught in where the attacker's moving laterally within the environment. If you know what accounts should be going to where, but almost nobody knows that. You wouldn't know if it's an anomalous use of an account because nobody except for the person who runs that application knows what that account's supposed to be doing. But you really just have to have a combination of proactively going through your environment, looking for signs of anomalous activity from a network perspective, a host perspective, and then also apply as much outside intelligence as you can get about what's bad, because it can change so often with certain types of threats. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.